All right, we're going to talk about Chapter 10, conservation outside of protected areas. One of the key things about conservation outside of protected areas is to just recognize that we have a lot of potential habitats outside of designated protected areas, national parks, national wildlife refuges, and the likes that we really need for conservation of species, diversity, and ecosystems. Because the vast majority of land on the Earth's surface and waters fall outside of designated protected areas and fall into also that human footprint. And so species really need us to modify the way that we put our footprints on the landscape to help promote diversity and conservation in these areas that we reside. That will make things like corridors more effective between these conservation areas, make it more possible for species to coexist with humans outside of the protected areas when they move either deliberately or accidentally outside of a protected area and need to find resources, and reduce a lot of the conflicts that we have as well with larger animal species like moose, cougars, bears, etc. So there's a variety of different ways, and we'll talk about just a sliver of them today. And they range from the simplest things like planting a backyard flower garden that promotes pollinator species to full-scale reserving conservation on large swaths of agricultural lands, and in community-wide conservation too, as we'll talk about in a bit. So there's a lot of potential habitats outside of protected areas, and we need to be able to assess those for their conservation value. So landscapes that humans have a footprint in really have various patterns of species composition and impacts to those lands through our various activities: agriculture, housing, urban developments, industrial developments, etc. And we can control those activities to some extent and try to evaluate which ones are really going to be best suited for which species. So things like degraded wildlands or rangelands might actually, be able to get some conservation practices put in them, whether those are for grasslands and getting various grazing management plans on a rangeland put together, reforestation of degraded lands, using multi-use forests can actually promote some types of wildlife, especially if we have sustainable logging practices. And then we also, of course, have our national parks and other conservation areas that are really of high value. And then there's even some things like traditional agriculture that come into play, and how old traditional agricultural practices pre-industrialization can actually have larger benefits for wildlife, and integrating those into our other agricultural systems can really help. City parks are another thing, with other open spaces in urban areas, and then using suburban areas, even including some tree plantings and flower gardens, etc. And those can really help out with conservation. And so we can see in this image these various types of habitats and what kind of value they are for of conservation value overall, and then the processes that lead to that. So what we can see here is that the farther right on the graph, we have more natural states that occur, and then farther up we have more free types of management that occur in these things. So as we, down in the bottom left, industrial and urban is the most artificial and controlled environment that you can think of. Think of pavement, buildings, pollution, etc. Those are the things we really need to protect the natural areas from. And then as we move further right and up, we have less human intervention in every parts of the way the ecosystem functions and the geophysical processes that are associated with those ecosystems function, and then until we get to the top, right, where it's full-blown wilderness. So we have like suburban and exurban areas that are kind of there towards the middle, and rangelands that then become a little bit more of kind of a natural type of landscape, and finally up into the wilderness. And so we have to start thinking about this also in the sense of looking at specific species and the habitats they use, and how we can start to manage, protect areas outside of protected areas for conservation. So in this image, these golden dots represent radio telemetry of where panthers in Florida. The Florida panther has actually been tracked and seen. The blue areas are suitable breeding habitats for those panthers, and then the areas outlined in red are those spots that are actually conservation lands. And so we can see this large conservation land in here in this core area where my mouse is floating, and then these are all suitable habitats. These are where the panthers reside, and these are areas where the panthers have resided and been outside of those conservation areas. So you can see that there is quite a bit of panther habitat that is protected, but there's also quite a bit of area that they're using that is outside of those protected areas. And so figuring out how these animals use these areas and how we can reduce conflicts and make it easier for those animals in the long term is really going to be helpful. So there's a lot of different species that can really thrive in areas that we set up with conservation programs that are outside of those protected areas. So things that are really in human footprint, and parks, urban areas, and military lands. We'll kind of touch on that a little bit. Oftentimes these are going to be species that aren't necessarily those really rare sensitive species, but are species that are adapted to some frequent levels of disturbances, whether that's being on paths in parks or trees that can be planted in parks, birds that utilize a variety of different habitats, etc. And the diversity, though, when we start to manage these areas, it can really be just as high in these areas outside of the protection as those that are in protected areas. So thinking of things like neighborhood community councils, forest parks, and other and wetlands as well. So a lot of different groups can get behind these. Sometimes it's conservation organizations, sometimes it's neighborhoods, sometimes it's entire cities. Thinking of places like Anchorage, there's a watershed coalition, there's a watershed council, there's various or other organizations that work on conservation in the parks. The Anchorage Park Foundation, there's a cooperative invasive species management group that works to manage invasive species across all those different boundaries, and then various others that work towards management of water and wildlife at the state and city level. And all of these different groups can help promote conservation in these developed areas. And this picture from the book, this is actually a conservation area that was set up by a housing development in Florida to have wetlands there, and of course then that helps out the crane populations and other waterfowl and wetland species that utilize those areas. And then there's examples in urban areas too. The book uses this pale male, which is more of a charismatic red-tailed hawk, because it's uncharacteristically pale. That happens to live in built on top of some buildings in the urban area, and these birds are particularly sort of adapted to this environment because there's already rats and other things that they can feed on, pigeons and such, and the example they use is when local, birding organizations stepped up to preserve this when the building managers wanted to take down the nest. Military lands, though, the book highlights and is really a good thing that they do as a substantial contributor towards conservation in general. There's a substantial, huge number of endangered species that exist on military lands. Almost more endangered species exist on military lands than other conservation areas combined. And they have really good conservation strategies that exist on those military lands. They have contracts with local universities and conservation officers that work for them that assess the military land areas for invasive species, for endangered species, for preserving habitat qualities, and to work with the folks on those military lands so that the exercises that they do can coincide with those things. And of course, when you get to, if you ever go on to military land, you'll see areas that don't look like they're of much conservation value, but there's quite a bit of land that is there, that is open, seemingly untouched, and lots of wildlife and plant life thrives in those areas. Species, though, that are adapted to the military, these military practices, though, are going to be best suited if they're suited towards frequent disturbances and the types of disturbances that military activities will have. So occasional roads, firing practice, and the like. So conservation in an urban landscape gets pretty complicated, but we have to be able to look at it and evaluate the value that these different areas can have. And I think Anchorage makes a really interesting example of it. This is an aerial image of Anchorage. If we look actually to the upper right, since we just talked military lands, upper right on this graph, this is actually mostly military land by the Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson. And so you can see these large swaths of essentially just forest that's pretty close to untouched in those areas. There's some roads and things like that go through their training areas, but lots of wildlife exists in those areas. And then we have large parks in these areas, some of which butt up against the Chugach State Park, which is way over on the east end of this, Far North Bicentennial Park, a large conservation area that attaches to that. And then there's some green belts that run through this, meaning Campbell Creek, which is kind of in this little area here, following my mouse again through that. And then Chester Creek, which actually flows in from around up here somewhere. You can see these parks here work as kind of these conservation areas, and then conservation areas outside of these protected areas, and then more of that then coming down through this way in this part. We also have another big park in Kincaid Park, which is a former military area that is now turned to park, and that is unique because it actually is not only a large area next to the airport, but also kind of butts up with the Anchorage Coastal Wildlife Refuge, which runs all the way down here and then south of Anchorage. And all of these areas are actually of really high value in wildlife conservation. There's significant amount of bear movement, moose movement. You can see lynx and other birds of prey and wildlife that you don't normally see in urban areas of this size in other more impacted areas. And these parks and the conservation that goes along along with them with the Watershed Coalition, various nonprofits we mentioned previously, Watershed Councils, Cooperative Invasive Species Management, plays a lot into maintaining these areas as good areas for wildlife, even though they're not of high protected status. So when we start to talk about agriculture and using resources for our own consumption, there are practices. Not all practices are equal, of course. So things like clear-cut logging and open agriculture are things that can be more impactful on the environment than selective logging and in this case shade-grown coffee or more diverse forms of agriculture. And so the economies to promote conservation have started to develop certification programs to assist with this. And in one of those certification programs involves shade-grown coffee, which there's some debate and need to look into more stringent versions of coffee certification. But the general idea is that in shade-grown coffee, instead of having this kind of agricultural that's more monoculture that you see on the right with heavy pesticide influence likely to keep those rows clean, we have a more diverse forest canopy over the coffee plantation that's underneath. This is going to support more wildlife, have less inputs, and just in general be a bit better for the environment. When the book also brings up the Forest Stewardship Council, and that involves using selective and sustainable logging practices and certifying timber as coming from those practices. So if you go to places and buy lumber, there's a little stamp that might say FSC on it, and that means that was sustainably logged. So these practices can be brought up in a variety of different ways. There's obviously organic agricultural certification programs, and we could even implore to get things like that for tea plantations and the like. And one of the things that you really have to consider with this is to make sure that it addresses the environmental concerns that actually exist from the practice, but also the concerns for human livelihoods, that people are being well taken care of and are paid livable wages for doing the practices in these ways, because oftentimes there's going to be less output than your traditional large-scale agricultural practices that are more industrial. So ecosystem management is another practice that we can talk about for large-scale management of ecosystems in this human footprint environment. And so what ecosystem management involves is bringing together stakeholders, farming, industrial developments, conservation organizations, and all those groups that affect a large ecosystem and receive some benefit from it. We have to work with those groups then to create a system of large-scale management that involves all those stakeholders. And the primary goal then is preserving ecosystem components and processes over the long term while still satisfying the needs of that community and society. So it's not just having forested green belts, but also having parks within those adjacent to those green belts that people can use for other types of recreation like soccer or baseball, preserving some areas for wildlife refuge within that, having areas where we protect the water from pollution, etc., and then wildlife areas and the like, but also allowing for some industrialization and heavy developments as well. So eco-colonialism is something that we seek to avoid, and it's about respecting the local native or indigenous cultures that that reside there. And so we can define eco-colonialism as disregarding traditional rights and practices when during conservation, and that's usually by the government or conservation organizations that are trying to assert conservation into a particular area. And if we ignore then the local practices, then that can be just as bad or receive just as much resistance from those local indigenous cultures as if we were going to come in and extract the resource from them. So we need to figure out how to avoid this eco-colonialism. And there's some variety of strategies that are talked about in the book to do that. One is giving legal title to land. So in this graph or image, we have a percent of area that is indigenous lands, and so indigenous people can manage or have tenure rights over a lot of land. Spanning on most of these continents, and so this shows percentages in these different continents where there is legal title to the land, and you see that some areas have quite a bit. Africa, even parts of Russia and Australia. The U.S. doesn't have very much other than in a few particular areas. We can also seek to use co-management, and co-management works with these local indigenous groups to manage give them a seat at the table, a significant seat at the decision-making table for management of the resources and ecosystems where they reside, working with the conservation organizations like Fish and Wildlife Service or Department of Fish and Game to set up regulations, set up hunting and fishing quotas and logging quotas, etc. We also have to work towards integrating conservation and development, and what that means is that we allow for more types of traditional agriculture and more ability for the local populations and indigenous populations to benefit financially from developing the resources in the lands that they manage and traditionally used, whether that's through logging or fishing or other types of extraction, and working with those folks, of course, to try to make sure that it's sustainable. And oftentimes, though, these can be, the locals will manage it appropriately, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. There's also things like biosphere reserves, and biosphere reserves we talked about in the previous lesson. And this is a picture of a biosphere reserve, a part of a biosphere reserve here. And remember, a biosphere reserve has a core area where it's basically managed only for the wildlife, and then they have buffer areas with different types of extractive and uses that are allowed. And so having biosphere reserves where we allow local indigenous cultures to go in and use things, harvest plants, animals in traditional ways is for traditional purposes is important in avoiding eco-colonialism. We can also do things like in situ agricultural conservation, which is essentially preserving older forms of agriculture. It's like things like traditional versions of potatoes from South America, and the practices that went into traditional agricultural practices, so that we can preserve that biodiversity of those agricultural species. And then also extractive reserves, areas where we allow for the use and harvest of traditional natural resources. by locals. And so this example in this picture here is an extractive reserve in Brazil, in the forests, and what they're doing is getting from rubber trees. They cut for latex, which then flows out of those grooves, and then it gets processed to make natural rubber products. We can also try to avoid eco-colonialism through community-based initiatives. This is when it's similar to co-management and simply allowing locals to manage things themselves. The idea is that through community-based initiatives, elders get involved in helping guide traditional uses and conservation that will benefit those species over time. There's also a lot of ways that we can set up payments for ecosystem services, and these graphs here or figures show various patterns of payments for ecosystem services in a bunch of different countries, and there's projects and things like that that are going into payments for habitat conservation, preventing overharvesting, pollution, climate change, invasive species, and the like, and what funders went into that. Some examples of programs come from the NRCS in the U.S., which is the Natural Resource Conservation Service. They have programs for farmers called Conservation Reserve, Grassland Reserve, Wetland Reserves, where they'll actually pay farmers to take their portions of their land out of production of an agricultural commodity, provide them payments, and in turn they have to promote a certain amount of grassland, wetland, or other diversity in these areas, and put them on reserve from agricultural practices.